The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Jeremiah Healy. My name is Bruce Southworth. I'm a mystery reviewer for Once Upon a Crime Mystery Books in Minneapolis. As I mentioned, our guest today is Jeremiah Healy. He is the author of a series about John Francis Cuddy, a Boston-based private investigator. Jerry is an attorney, and he's a full-time law professor at the New England School of Law. To date, he's written 8 John Cuddy books, starting with Blunt Darts in 1984, and most recently, Foursome, which is his latest book. Welcome.
Thank you, Bruce.
Kind of a silly question to start with, but I was wondering, with the current successes of Scott Turow and John Grisham, do you ever wish that John Francis Cuddy had finished law school and gone on to be a trial character as opposed to a private investigator?
I don't think so. When I originally created the Cuddy character, I wanted him to be a private investigator. He's a Vietnam veteran who returns from the war, loses his wife young to cancer, and in effect to rehabilitate himself decides to go into private investigation. I gave him a year of law school so that I could talk about the things that I as an attorney and law professor was concerned about, and yet have it be credible coming from his mouth as the first person narrator in the books. So I don't think I'm sorry that I didn't have him be a trial attorney, because most of my plot lines deal with the problems of cases that slip through the system that in fact lawyers and the system don't deal with very well.
So would that be one of the big advantages then, is not only being a mystery writer but a trial attorney and a law professor? You can explore that small percentage of cases?
I think so. For example, in my third book, So Like Sleep, I deal with the problem of a young black college student who's accused of murdering his white girlfriend during a hypnosis session in a group therapy context. And as a law professor, I can talk about what the issues are about having someone who's been hypnotized try to appear as a competent witness at trial, because the act of hypnotism tends to alter the memory and therefore make someone not appropriate as a witness. But it's also the problem of the legal system not dealing particularly well with a case of black on white crime.
There was another of your books, The Right to Die, that had a lot of, I think, interesting legal issues. A professor, Maisie Andrus, was under a death threat, as I believe I remember that. How do you go about digging into researching all the different aspects? As I recall in that book, there was not only the sort of the euthanasia aspect, there was a skinhead group that was prevalent, and there was an AIDS group that was prevalent. How do you assimilate all of those different points of view and the legal aspects that might be involved in all of those?
Right to Die, which came out in the summer of 1991, deals with whether or not we have a right to assisted suicide, but in the mystery context. The law professor you refer to, Maisie Andrus, is one of the principal characters, and she crusades for the right to die and receives death threats as a result. The mystery hook is, who would send death threats to someone who crusades for the right to die? It sounds kind of anomalous. But as a law professor, mystery writer, what I was able to explore in that book were the different points of view on the right to die. The ethical issue, the medical issues, the familial issues. And what I tried to do was do a lot of research, talk to a lot of people involved in the problem of right to die, and give each of the principal suspect characters a credible point of view in this spectrum of whether or not we should have the right to assisted suicide. It frankly was one of the most interesting books I've ever written, and also it got me a tremendous amount of, you might almost say, backdoor publicity, because it was the same summer that the Dr. Kevorkian problems first arose, that Derek Humphrey did his book Final Exit, and as a result, if the TV and radio talk show people couldn't get Kevorkian or Humphrey, they tended to turn to the mystery writer who'd also explored the field.
I agree. I think the one of the interesting things about that book is that your research and enthusiasm for exploring those points of view really came out. There was a point at which Cuddy is attending a lecture by Maisie Andrus and so on, and that's one thing I was curious about too, which is a little bit off the legal point, is how you establish such a real voice for each of those groups, coming at it as you are as a single individual, how do you get yourself into the headset of a skinhead, for example?
One of the advantages of having been a trial attorney before I began writing the mysteries is that you tend to have to identify with the witness you might be forced to call in a trial, put on the stand in a trial, even if you don't believe in his or her overall views. You may be stuck with the only person who was at an intersection when two cars collided. And as a result, you tend to spend time talking with the witnesses, getting a sense of who they are and how to present them to, in effect, an audience called the jury in the courtroom. I think as a mystery writer, you do very much the same thing. You have to visualize a character who would be credible in a given context for the readers as an audience. And then you basically have to get inside the head of that individual. And for example, in the chapter from Right to Die that you're referring to, there's a debate at the Boston Public Library, Rab Lecture Hall, 400-seat auditorium. And it involves a Jewish doctor who's very much concerned about the right to die aspects, harking back to the Nazis eliminating those they thought weren't fit to continue. A black female preacher who's very much concerned about what this would have as an impact on her community, the people who are perceived to be on welfare and so on and so on. And Maisie Andrus, the law professor who crusades for the right to die. The debate is interrupted by a skinhead, Nazi sympathizer. And what I was hopefully able to do was take the same technique that I used in the courtroom as a trial attorney, visualizing these people on the witness stand and asking them questions that would help the jury understand the case they were hearing, and apply them to the mystery writer presenting a story to the reader as audience.
From the point of view of technique, let's springboard into actually then how you construct your books. I know you've written articles about plotting and structure and so on. Can you give us a little bit of an idea how you approach a book, say if you've got an idea for a new novel? What would you do first, and how would you go about structuring it?
Sure. When you're a trial attorney, you need to be in control of the case to the extent you can be. And that tends to mean that you picture a final destination, the jury coming back in your favor with a verdict. In order to get the jury to come back in your favor, you have to persuade the trial judge there's enough evidence for the jury to rule for you. In order to present enough evidence during the trial, you have to do a lot of formal discovery, exchange of information between the parties to a case, and informal investigation on your own sometimes. And all of this, in a backstepping way, takes you to the initial client conference that you had with the individual that you're representing. Well, when I write a mystery novel, I take the same approach. I have the idea, the kernel of a storyline that involves someone as the killer for a given motive. I then visualize chapter 30, so to speak, the final confrontation scene between my private investigator character, John Cuddy, and the killer. In order for chapter 30 to make sense, something has to have happened in 29. For 29 to make sense, something has to have happened in 28. And all the way back to chapter 1, when the Cuddy character meets the client in the private investigator office. When you inductively reason from a known destination backwards to a beginning, you can then write forward in a very consistent, logical manner that keeps you from painting yourself into a corner and also gives the reader fair clues at different points in the course of the story, because you as the mystery novelist know how it will eventually end.
So you're, excuse me, you're plotting. I mean, that's essentially your plot, what happens to the course of the story. This happens, and this happens. And the structure then becomes the order in which you tell those events.
Exactly.
I see. Okay. In the sort of the fluff, if you will, going around a story, the plot and the structure, I was reading a review by Marilyn Stasio, I think is how her name is pronounced, in the New York Times, who said that you sort of go in for the glossy postcard view of Boston, sort of photo ops. I was wondering if you thought that was kind of fair, because there are a lot of violent things that occur in your stories. Again, the skinheads, and in Foursome, 4 people are murdered by crossbow. I was wondering what if you had a thought on that kind of commentary, if you keep a real pleasant view of Boston in mind all the time.
One of the things as a writer that you have to be careful of is not to be overly influenced by what reviewers say. And the reason for that is that a reviewer is giving his or her best take on a given book. And that best take may be a fair and defensible view. As in Marilyn Stasio's case, I think, in fact, I do use sort of glossy postcard descriptions of parts of Boston. I do that for a reason, though, and the reason is an awful lot of people around this country spent 3 or 4 of the happiest years of their lives in education in Boston, undergraduate or graduate, and a lot more have come to Boston on vacation, for the Boston Marathon, for a host of other reasons. And by giving these sort of benchmark geographical locations within the city of Boston, described as perhaps a visitor might have seen them, I can give the reader a sense of where things are in the course of the story without having to spend perhaps quite as much time describing elaborately a given setting for the reader who might not at all be familiar with a different city that isn't quite as frequently visited.
Let's take a different tack. I was wondering, 1984 was when Blunt Darts appeared. Had you written fiction before that? Was that the first thing of yours that had appeared?
I really hadn't written any book-length works before that. When I was in high school, I wrote short stories for the sort of literary magazine. But in college and law school, the analytical writing you had to do, and appropriately had to do, pretty much pushed out any time you had for creative writing. As a trial attorney, it was 60, 70 hours a week, no time at all for anything else. But when I became a law professor and realized I'd have summers off to do other projects, I said, well, gee, I've always wanted to write a novel. I now have the block of free mind time to actually work on a novel. And at the time, I was reading and very much enjoying private investigator fiction. Robert B. Parker, John D. MacDonald, not quite private investigator, but very close. And as a result, I thought, well, gee, if I enjoy reading these, maybe I'm capable of writing one. But even if I'm not capable of writing one, I'll enjoy trying. And Blunt Darts was the first book that I ever wrote. It involves the Cuddy character, introduces the Cuddy character, and involves him in the search for the missing son of a judge. The mystery hook in that book is, well, the judge doesn't want the son found. Why would a judge not want one of his children who's missing found?
And we're not going to tell anybody why that is either, because it's a book that should be read. It was marvelous. When you approached creating the Cuddy character, I mentioned this to you earlier, but do people assume that you're the character? Where did you sort of get the inspiration to create him, and maybe on a larger scale, how do you view Cuddy as a private investigator in the sort of the whole of private investigator employment or whatever?
When I started writing the books, I didn't have anybody as a mentor to turn to. And as a result, I figured I had to create a character whose voice and personality I could visualize and therefore stay consistent with over the course of the books. What I did was I took my dad and an uncle of mine, both of whom were World War II veterans, and in effect made a composite of them. The Cuddy character is a military police captain in Vietnam and an insurance investigator thereafter before he becomes a private investigator. My dad was a military police officer. My uncle was an insurance investigator. And by taking this composite of the two of them, I was able to picture how they would react and what they would do in given situations. I also wanted to give a better view on the Vietnam veteran than typically the media tended to cast. Most Vietnam veterans came back from Vietnam, took up their lives with some degree of friction, but then became perfectly productive citizens, good fathers, good people in the community. And that's in effect what I have the Cuddy character doing, with maybe the attitude of a World War II era veteran of, if my wife passed away, I would stay faithful to her memory, as I pictured my dad and my uncle doing in that context.
Do you see him as a sort of a, trying to think, Les Roberts, I think, suggested that the mystery is a sort of current version of the medieval morality play, and the detective is an everyman. Do you see the private investigator, either Cuddy or the genre, in that light, or is he sort of Don Quixote tilting at windmills, or how do you see the whole private investigator personality in the genre?
A couple of years ago, Lauren Esselman, a mystery writer from Detroit, and I spoke at the International Congress of Crime Writers in New York, and we had this debate. And Lauren's position is not so much Les's position. Les says medieval knight. Lauren says cowboy. And it's interesting that the cowboy in American fiction is kind of the individual who brings law to a lawless land, when in fact in the real world there's a good reason they were called cowboys and not cowmen. They were for the most part 13 or 14-year-old orphans who were mounted day labor and who carried guns but only to turn stampedes. They couldn't have hit the broadside of the barn with one. The nice thing about the private investigator genre for someone like me writing fiction is that as a trial lawyer, I know that private investigators in the real world are not so much loner heroes as they are ambulatory administrative assistants for lawyers. They in effect perform paralegal functions of talking to witnesses to an incident, searching for documents in public offices, and so forth. But we have this sense, I think, fictionally, of the private investigator as the person who brings justice to a law-bound society, the person who brings a degree of justice to the 2 or 3% of cases that really do fall through the cracks in the system. And in that sense, I suppose I see the private investigator as a little bit less medieval knight, a little bit more our fictionalized view of the cowboy, but in fact a little bit of a vigilante, because if you enjoy reading private investigator fiction, I think you have to accept that for the most part the private investigator does things outside the system that we would be very troubled to see someone inside the system actually doing because of concerns about police state and that sort of thing.
Are you familiar with John Dunning's book, Book to Die? What you've just said reminds me of his main character, who's a policeman who sort of gets fed up with the system, takes a few matters into his own hand and then quits, but he's still involved in solving the crime that was the base of the whole thing. And I can see where there would be a sort of a troubling aspect to a police character doing that, or a person who's a policeman, even if he has retired from doing that sort of thing.
I had been myself in military police as a lieutenant and eventually a captain like my dad had been, and also in civilian law enforcement. And I guess I'm sensitive to that problem. There's a certain amount of authority excuse me, that you have when you carry a badge and a gun that is different from the authority you have as a private citizen looking into a problem. And one of the books that I wrote, Yesterday's News, which deals with the death of the confidential source of a reporter, arose from that. When I was in real life practice, I represented a lot of newspapers, and I tried to keep reporters out of jail when they would refuse to reveal their confidential sources. One of my real life cases involved a reporter who investigated police corruption in a given town. And he was threatened with jail for not, in effect, giving information that might have helped police officers who were accused of corruption, who were accused of brutality especially. And as a former police officer, I could identify with the police. As the lawyer, I had to identify with my client, and that basically formed the basis of Yesterday's News, in which I have the reporter being a woman investigating police brutality, her source, instead of remaining confidential, being killed, and the reporter, quite naturally suspicious of the authorities, doesn't turn to the police to investigate the incident. She hires the private investigator, John Cuddy, to try to find out what happened and why.
You mentioned the authority of the private investigator. I was wondering, it's always been intriguing to me how much the private investigator, as he's moving through the story, he gets people to open up and talk. I guess the common thinking is that people will talk about themselves given the chance, but still it seems very interesting that with relative ease he's able to elicit so much information from people. In your experience, both as an attorney and in law enforcement, is that fairly valid, or is it, again, a kind of a stylized, fictionalized aspect of the private investigator novel?
I think a little bit of it is stylized and fictionalized. Whenever the Cuddy character speaks to someone who's reluctant, I try to have a reasonable real-life leverage in there for why the individual either could be persuaded to talk or would have an incentive to talk. Another thing that I found in writing the books is that because I have the Cuddy character be a widower, and someone who feels close enough to his dead wife to still go to her graveside and have conversations with her, which is something that I thought might be a little odd until I got a lot of letters from people saying that's exactly what I do with my close relative who passed away. By having him be a widower, I think he can empathize pretty well with the typical person in a private investigator novel that he would be going to talk to. Because after all, he's going to tend to be interviewing men and women who have just lost either a close family member, a business associate, or a neighbor to some usually violent death. And I think he becomes a more empathetic and credible character for them to talk to as a result.
I've noticed, I'm glad you brought up the, his wife, because it seems as though over the course of the books, his conversations with her have both increased and decreased across some of the books, but remained pretty constant, but yet he's grown quite a bit as an individual. His new relationship with Nancy, the assistant district attorney?
Yes.
I was curious too, as he's grown and made these changes throughout his book, do these reflect in any way changes that have been going on in your life, or are they strictly the force of John Cuddy's life through the books? Is there a separation, or is there a connection?
I've been pretty fortunate in my own life to have avoided, for the most part, any real tragedy. When I was in law enforcement, I dealt to some extent with organized crime and therefore learned a little bit about how the mob worked. And in Shallow Graves, the 7th book in the series, I deal with the granddaughter of a mob figure who is herself a model being killed, and the mob turning to Cuddy rather than the authorities to investigate the death. But for the most part, the books don't really reflect my own personal life. One of the nice compliments that I've been paid by you today and by others in the past is that the character does grow. It's not simply a static cipher for the author's plot, but rather, in this case, a man who moves on through life. And in the summer of 1993, touring with Nancy Picard, who is another pocketbooks author, we both have had, at different stops along the way, people ask us the question, both of your characters seem to grow, they seem to change, and since they're both first-person narratives, the principal character talking to the reader as though the reader were a companion, the readers tend to find that this companionability aspect of someone who grows and changes as the reader in real life is growing and changing makes for a more close feeling of friendship, more close affinity for what the character has happening in his or her life.
Yeah, I find from a personal point of view, whenever I get the latest of your books, that I'm curious to find out what's happened to John Cuddy in the time between the last book and the beginning of this book, and oftentimes it's interesting to go back to the end of the one just to refresh my memory as to what's actually happened, so that kind of get that connection, because that does seem to there does seem to be that flow and growth. Just in a real basic question, are there any hints or nibbles at television or movie on the Cuddy character?
You know, it's interesting. Thanks to Robert B. Parker, who created the Spencer series, there was a tremendous upsurge in interest in what I'll call regional private investigators, meaning private investigators who aren't headquartered in either New York or Los Angeles, which was the stereotypical situation. And when my first book came out, Bob Parker was nice enough to sit down, have drinks with me, and give me some of the insight about what was going on in his life, as well as how you handled these sorts of things. And I think the best advice I ever got was, whenever somebody approaches you for a movie or television rights, bear in mind that just because they have a business card that says independent producer on it and some nice letterhead and a fancy address back in Southern California, doesn't necessarily mean they've ever made any movies or television series. A lot of these people are contacting you as what you and I would call finders. They've never made a movie. What they do is they offer you $100,000 for the rights to your books, and then go to California and try to sell them for $500,000 to a real producer and pocket the difference. And so as a result, you have to be a little bit careful about that. Also, advice that Bob gave me, have a lot of books out in your series. In my case, I have 8 out. When I have about 10 out is when I'll seriously start courting Hollywood and hope that they court me back. Because with 10 books out in the series, you will actually sell very well in the bookstores when people who go to the movie or watch the television series say, gee, I didn't know there were books about this character whom I like. I'll go to the bookstores, for example, Once Upon a Crime here in Minneapolis, Uncle Edgar's, and buy those books so that I can find out more in depth about the character I've come to enjoy on the screen.
And hope that they haven't taken and completely transformed them on the screen from the written word. You mentioned Robert Parker and John D. MacDonald. I was curious in the kind of the current, well, Parker's still current, but in the current mystery scene, who do you like to read? Who are your favorites, if you have time?
I'd be happy to name a few people. One of the problems with naming anyone is that by omitting someone from the list, you tend to say, well, that person wouldn't be good also, so feel free to remind me of some other people. But I think currently the 3 best practitioners of the private investigator novel, not mysteries in general, but private investigator fiction, are Lawrence Block, Sue Grafton, and Lauren Esselman. And among the people who only have a few books out, the ones who I would watch are Linda Barnes, from the Boston area, Jerome Doolittle, also writing in the Boston area, and Robert Crace, who writes from Southern California. I think those 3 people will be the folks who you'll be interviewing a couple of years from now on this show as you're interviewing me today.
I would love to be interviewing all of those particular people. Stepping back, now that we know who you read now, I was curious who, and again in the creation of the character, who were your influences when you started to write? Were they fictional writers, or did you look to kind of practitioners of good technical writing, or who were your influences when you started out?
I was actually very lucky to have as influences not just the people in the mystery field who I read and enjoyed, but when I was in 10th grade, the school system I attended in New Jersey was really very progressive. Although it was a public school, they spent money on the education of their students. And about 20 of us had the opportunity to take as our English course a 3-day-a-week teacher from the old school, Boston Latin School retired professor, who came in and drilled us on grammar, punctuation. We had to stand and declaim as though we were in a 19th century English school system. And then for the other 2 days of the week, they brought in a twice-published novelist to teach us creative writing. And what I thought was really interesting about that combination was that for 3 days a week you had to drill, for 2 days a week you got to soar with the wind beneath your wings, but you came to appreciate in those 2 days a week that you were doing creative writing how important it was to get the drill down right, so you were making fewer technical mistakes in the course of creating what you'd hope would be enjoyable reading.
Sounds like an interesting cross-section. I think that would be very interesting to try and drill some of that technique into people's minds a little bit. But specifically, so those were your influences in that sense. How about as far as authors go, that you really look to say, I'd like to be like that person, or like the way they write?
I thought that Robert B. Parker had some of the best dialogue I'd ever heard. And you tend to be a strict judge of dialogue if you're a trial attorney, because when you stop and think about it, what does a trial attorney really do in a courtroom? He or she keeps one eye and one ear on the witness to make sure the witness is saying what you need the witness to say. And you keep the other eye and the other ear on the jury to make sure the jury is hearing what you want the jury to hear. And as a mystery writer, you tend to do the same thing. And I think Bob Parker does it as well as anyone. You listen to what the character is saying to you to make sure the character is saying what's necessary to move the story along. But you also have to keep an eye and an ear on the reader to make sure the reader is getting what you want the reader to get. And sometimes you have to go back and rewrite a chapter that is perfectly fine standing alone, out of context, but isn't quite what you need to have the jury, the audience, the reader hear at that particular point in time.
As far as what might be happening to the particular characters, or what evidence is put out? And
also, there's an issue of authenticity. The writers who I admire the most are the ones who get the non-fiction aspects of their fictional works right. In the courtroom, you learn very quickly that if you don't have your facts straight, you won't just lose the jury for that trial. You'll tend to lose the judge for much of your career, because the judge finds he or she can't rely on what you represent as being accurate. In my second book, The Staked Goat, the Cuddy character looks into the death of a friend of his from the Army. And much of that book is set in Vietnam. As a result of me having been in the military police, I could talk about the military police characteristics, but I hadn't served in Vietnam. So I read 12 books on Vietnam, from Stanley Carnow's nonfiction encyclopedic treatment to Mark Baker's Nam, which is a series of oral recollections of men and women who had actually served there. And I was fortunate that I'd gotten from those sources a pretty good sense of what it was like to be in Vietnam. Even then, though, a friend of mine who graciously volunteered, not something you could ask someone to do, he was in Vietnam himself for 2 tours. He reads those chapters to make sure, as kind of a technical proofreader, that I haven't gotten something wrong that someone who had actually been there would immediately spot as jarring or clashing.
Okay, well, I thank you very much for the discussion today. I appreciate it very much. It's been a great pleasure, Jeremiah Healy.
Same,
Thank
Bruce.
you.
Thank you very much.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.